You're listening to Patriarch, the story of Abraham as told by me, Colin Piper, recorded from our little croft up here in the Scottish Highlands. To find out more about Patriarch and about life and all ministry and everything that we're doing up here, please go to BibleNovels.com. Patriarch, Chapter 2, Part 4. The apartments were lavishly furnished with woods which, although Sarai was unaware of the fact, in Egypt were more valuable than silver. Each was inlaid with mother of pearl, and the sofas padded with the softest duck feathers. The king's bed was huge and golden, with enough linen sheets and fur covers to suggest it might be possible for someone to get lost in there. And the shocking thing was that Pharaoh, who looked small even with his crown on, without it and without his wig, looked positively puny and ordinary. Again, Sarai wasn't to know this, but few people ever saw their God like this. What Sarai was about to find out that evening wasn't through whatever conversation their limited shared language allowed, but mainly through her skilled intuition. In fact, it wasn't too hard to work out that the king was tired and lonely. Playing the role of a god is a hard job, unless you happen to be one, which it was evident Pharaoh was not. Even playing it being a king is hard enough, and it was equally evident Pharaoh was tired of this too. He was apparently slowly gaining more and more power at a chaotic time in Egypt's history, with many pretenders to the throne, but at some personal cost. Sarai could tell he was wondering whether it was worth it. More than all this, though, Sarai was later to learn that in the complex in which she'd been housed, there were over 300 wives and concubines. And although he couldn't admit it, Pharaoh was tired of these too, which is why he was genuinely pleased with Sarai. Here wasn't a young plaything, but evidently a most beautiful woman of maturity and depth. Could it be his commander was right, and he had found what he sought more than anything else, and what he'd been prepared to pay extravagantly for? A companion. Sarai just sat for a while with the tired little man until he fell asleep, and then she was led out of his rooms by someone who must have been watching all the time. It seemed even the most private of scenes of Pharaoh's life were watched. Then she was taken back into her rooms and undressed by Hagar, before slipping into the softest of beds, which forbade any lingering before sleep. Abram spent one night at the palace before returning to find his camp significantly increased. He came to Egypt to survive, but in fact had prospered, and yet at what cost? Vast numbers of sheep, cattle, donkeys, even camels had been added by Pharaoh to his livestock, and maid and manservants to his household, but he would trade them all, and all else besides, for the one he'd just given away. Without her, he was a tired, lonely, pathetic old man. On the other hand, with her, Pharaoh had found a newness of life. Language was still something of a barrier, but just being with her gave him something no other woman had ever managed. For her part, Sarai was discovering that for all her sense of loss and grievance, life in an Egyptian harem wasn't so very bad. Her quarters centered around a beautiful courtyard, including water gardens and a thatched baratza, or a wall-less building, in which she could while away some time. And she wasn't even confined to the palace. She had freedom to roam if escorted by her entourage, and slowly became familiar with the city of Alexandria. She even bathed in the river. Of course, she still missed her husband, because despite everything, she loved him and longed for him. But she couldn't deny there were aspects of her new life she enjoyed. She didn't appreciate the company of the other women in the harem, but did enjoy sitting at the table with Pharaoh and his male guests with whom she was allowed to converse. It would have been different if the king had made demands of her sexually or in other ways, but he didn't. It might also have been different if she hadn't had Hagar. Pharaoh had made it clear to her that Hagar was his gift to her, and for that alone Sarai was grateful. The girl would do anything for her, and always brought her such joy that Sarai simply couldn't imagine Hagar being capable of anything bad. Bad things, though, were happening in the palace. Although at first Sarai was unaware of this, both because of her newness to the palace and her limited language, which meant she often missed or failed to pick up the unusual. However, people were getting sick for no apparent reason, and no medication seemed to remedy the illnesses. The first Sarai really became aware that something was up was when she went on what had become a routine visit to Pharaoh's apartment, only to find him in bed, listless. More disconcerting still to Sarai was the company which sat around his bed. It was obvious the physician had been squeezed out and had been replaced by a sinister bunch whose every demeanour made Sarai uneasy. Their hostility to her was apparent. It was as though she had given the answer to a hard question with which they'd been grappling for a long time, even though she had in fact said nothing. Sarai, however, wasn't the only one to notice this, and a figure moved from the shadows and disappeared quickly through the curtained archway. When Abram greeted the commander, he saw immediately this was no friendly visit. Few words were spoken before Abram was taken back to Pharaoh's palace. Despite all the gifts Pharaoh had bestowed upon him, this was Abram's first visit back to the palace, and he searched desperately for a sight of Sarai. Everything was different this time. There was no sign of the celebration they'd known at the banquet. In fact, the palace was hushed and tense. There certainly was not the welcome he'd enjoyed on his first visit. No apartments this time. Simply an antechamber in which to stand and wait. And wait he did. The sun began to sink in the sky, and there was no respite. No chair, no drink, no news, until finally Abram was summoned. The sight of Pharaoh slumped on cushions behind the low-level table was shocking in comparison with the revered figure he'd last seen, and it was evident from the expression on the face of the commander who stood behind him that in some way and for some reason Abram was to be held responsible. When Pharaoh finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "What have you done to me?" He rasped and paused for breath, giving Abram's mind time to race. He really had no idea of what he was being accused and why. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" Abram's head spun. This was all too much. He couldn't take in what was being said and consequently couldn't anticipate where it was all going. He could just stand powerlessly and listen to his fate being worked out. Pharaoh swayed a little as he sat, causing his commander to flinch. Such was his degree of readiness for his lord. Pharaoh knew it and raised his fingers just fractionally to put his loyal servant at ease, and then he continued, "Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife?" Again Pharaoh paused, but not for an answer. He didn't want or need any. He was more tired than ever, not just physically, but emotionally, and his last words to Abram were more weary than threatening. "Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go." With that, the commander nodded, and Sarai was led into the chamber. She was dressed in the clothes in which she'd come to the palace that first night, and was accompanied by a young slave girl. For a moment there was awkwardness, as no one seemed to know what to do. Abram wanted to run to his wife. He also wanted to run with his wife, but in the end he just stood there with one eye on the commander to see what he would do. Everything about him suggested his next act would be murder, but in fact, although hostile, his next acts were less deadly. He nodded again, and this time an escort formed up, and both Abram and Sarai, together with the slave girl, had little choice over their actions as they were caught up in a rush towards the door. The camp was quickly dismantled, and despite the lateness of the time, some ground was made and distance put between them and Pharaoh's guards. Quickly, however, it became apparent they would come to no harm. How the commander had found out about Abram's economy with the truth wasn't clear, nor would they ever know why Pharaoh's spiritists had put the blame for the palace's ailments on Sarai. Furthermore, they didn't hang around long enough to discover that once rid of Sarai, the palace was rid of disease as well. The party were back on their way to the Negev. Not much wiser, but very much richer in livestock, silver, gold, and servants, one of whom was a young girl called Hagar. Fear stalked the travellers for days as they distanced themselves from Egypt. The party were aware that they'd humiliated and literally plagued Pharaoh, and to rub salt into the wounds they left with some of his wealth, albeit unnoticeable in the context of what remained. They couldn't be sure that Pharaoh wouldn't at any time choose to come chasing them across the desert, in which case surely only a miracle from God could save them. However, as their distance from Egypt increased, so this tension abated, only to be replaced by other all too familiar stress points. First returned the pressures of living in the desert, except now they had increased livestock and even more people to feed and water, and these pressures began to express themselves in ways the party had never known before. Petty squabbles blew up from nowhere in the desert heat, particularly between Abram's herdsmen and those of Lot's, although Abram himself was blissfully unaware of most of these. For him, there was a far more pressing tension. Sarai was remote and aloof, spending her time with her new Egyptian maidservant. Abram felt awkward in her presence, and by night would again seek solitude with and solace from his God. Here he could regain a perspective. Here he was reminded that the possessed Canaanite worshippers ahead of them, and Pharaoh's commander of the guard behind, they were just mere mortal men. Here his wealth of jewels and gold in the darkness of the night were just cold, hard lumps of stone or metal. Here, nothing seemed to matter. Not even where he'd come from, or indeed where he was going. Here, there was only one thing of any importance, and here he began to understand that his real journey was not back into a promised land, but back into God himself. And every night that he came before his God, the nature of that journey became a little clearer. Coming back to God was different to anything he'd learned or heard about any other God. Somehow his God didn't need appeasing, which was a good thing. His God was no carved household item, but the God of heaven. And if he were to sacrifice all he had, he knew this still wouldn't be enough. More than this, though, he became increasingly aware of what he realized he'd always known deep down. He may have left his God, but God hadn't left him. He'd been right there with him throughout it all. How else could he explain the bizarre events which had taken place? His God was the same God who felt just the same way about him when he turned away and failed as when he set out and worshipped. In fact, as he took time to reflect, he realized that he could learn at least as much about his God through the bad times as through the good. This was a truly remarkable journey of faith. And yet, even if God was there and despite everything did accept him, he knew in his heart of hearts it wasn't the same without the intimacy he'd begun to know but now lost. Abram's big question was, if sacrifice couldn't restore this, what could? The truth was, Abram felt as awkward in his God's presence as he did in his wife's. Night after night he sat beneath the stars with head bowed, unable to look up into heaven. He had nothing to give. The patriarch was powerless, humbled, poor. Until one morning, as the first light began to colour the darkness, finally reduced to utter and abject surrender, he had just one word left, which he sighed in his despondency and defeat, and then, without thinking too much more about it, he got up to head back to camp. When witnessed, morning by morning, the miracle of dawn loses something of its mystery. But what would it have been like to witness that first dawn? When uttered for the 1,000th time, maybe the word sorry loses its sense of value. But rather like a key, its significance lies not in itself, but rather in what it can unlock. This morning was the first time Abram fully realized the power of the word, which could renew all sense of mystery, even of the dawn itself. Sorry, bringing wholeness out of brokenness and relationship out of alienation. For all his newfound wealth, the most profitable gain from his time in Egypt was found in a word deceptively simple but devastatingly powerful. And suddenly, it was as though everything had a freshness, a vividness. It was almost unreal, a fantasy. Abram could hardly take it in. Could it be this easy? Everything inside him screamed it couldn't be. And yet Abram was learning to hear another voice in him, but not of him. A voice which said, yes, it could be. He may have been an old man, but this morning he fair skipped down the hill to the camp below. But then, as so often happened on the journey back from his private world with his God into his public world with his household, he realized again that whatever may have been understood or resolved in private would still need explaining and working out in public. Once more he stopped before Sarai's tent flap, once again hesitant, more like an uncertain, awkward adolescent about to intrude upon an adult world than a patriarch confronting his wife. On the one hand, Abram knew in his heart that if the word sorry could truly heal his relationship with the God of heaven, then how much more so it could do it with his humble wife. But on the other, saying sorry to the God of heaven seems somewhat easier to Abram than to his humble wife. Sarai sensed him at her tent entrance again. How many times had he come, lingered and left? How she wanted to reach out, pull him into her and love him in his weakness. For all the pain of rejection, the fear and humiliation, she loved him more today than ever before. And she knew why too. His God was now her God. She'd called out to him in her most vulnerable state when all else, including Abram, had abandoned her, and he had answered and protected her. She'd had plenty of time to reflect in the harem. At first she was in a panic. All around her was new and frightening, and the future was uncertain and so equally frightening. But slowly she became aware of his presence, protection, and then peace. Her confidence grew, and with it, her faith. This God wasn't just a man's God, her husband's God. He was a woman's God too, who was as real in a harem as anywhere else. And he brought dignity and purpose into her life as her gods. On those hot and frankly boring afternoons, her mind would race. Would she have made this discovery of faith anywhere else? Maybe that was why she could forgive Abram and even love him more. But she still needed him to make the first move. As soon as he did, she would respond. But somehow she knew in her heart that forgiveness can't restore relationship unless in response to true repentance. And so she would wait, sensing him at the door, willing him, praying him to come in, only night after night to sense him go. This night, she sensed him linger longer, and her heart raced as she heard his breathing. She sought to interpret his awkward fidgeting and hesitation, excited yet scared, eager yet apprehensive. She dared not get too carried away, but couldn't help herself, and ultimately couldn't help herself helping him. Abram, is that you? The curtain drew back, and she saw his outline in the doorway against the dim dawn light. She couldn't make out the expression on his face, but could piece it together from his stance, breathing, and movement, and in it she could read the words for which she longed. Slowly she pulled back the furs from over her and stretched out her arms to him. Clumsily he fell into her, losing his head in her chest, the man become child, the patriarch a dependent. And here a few muffled words sealed the past and opened a new future. That morning, she took him and led him in love like never before. Their love had found a new depth, as had their expression of it, such that in the aftermath, Sarai couldn't resist asking of her God her biggest question of all. Would this new depth of love result in the ultimate expression? But despite her newfound faith, the answer to this question still eluded her.
You're listening to the Patriarch podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support overseas mission.